1 cubic meter of the ocean turned into clean, drinkable water for about 28 cents. That is 1,000 liters, lifted straight out of the sea for less than the price of a bottle of water. At a plant on the coast of Shandong, China, is now making fresh water for less than what people in Beijing pay for what comes out of the tap. So why does the rest of the world still treat the ocean as the most expensive tap on Earth? Here is how China dropped the price, and the catch almost nobody mentions. Start with the basic problem, because it is the whole reason this was ever expensive. How do you get a clean glass of water out of seawater in the first place? Seawater is not just water with a little salt stirred in. The salt is dissolved right down into it, and nature works to keep it that way. Left alone, fresh water actually wants to flow toward the salty side, not away from it. To pull clean water back out, you have to fight that pull. The way China and most of the world does it now is called reverse osmosis. You take seawater and you shove it under enormous pressure against a membrane. Picture a filter so fine that water molecules can squeeze through it, but salt cannot. On one side, you collect clean water. On the other, you are left with a thick, salty leftover called brine. Simple idea. The idea was never the problem. The problem is the shoving. It takes a brutal amount of pressure to force seawater through, and that pressure comes from big, high-pressure pumps running on electricity. More than half the running cost of a plant like this is just the power bill for those pumps. That is the reason desalination earned its reputation. For decades, turning seawater into tap water meant paying for a mountain of electricity, which is why a place like California built one big plant and swallowed a price north of $2 per cubic meter. Water from the sea worked. It just cost a fortune. So the real question was never, can we do it? It was, can anyone make it cheap? This is where it gets interesting, because China pulled two levers at once. The first is a clever bit of plumbing called an energy recovery device. Remember that salty leftover, the brine? It leaves the membrane still under huge pressure, and for years plants simply threw that pressure away. An energy recovery device catches it and feeds it back into the incoming seawater, so the pumps do not have to work as hard. On its own, that one trick can cut the energy a plant needs from about 4.5 kilowatt hours per cubic meter down to roughly 2.5. For a large plant, that is over $7 million a year saved, just by refusing to waste pressure it already paid for. But the second lever is the one that changes the whole story. If electricity is most of the bill, the boldest move is to stop paying for energy at all. And that is exactly what a demonstration plant in the city of Rizhao on the Shandong coast just did. Instead of buying power, it runs on low-grade waste heat, the leftover warmth pouring off nearby steel mills and petrochemical plants. Heat those factories were already dumping into the air. Rizhao grabs that free waste heat, uses it to help drive the process, and the cost of the water itself falls to about 2 yuan per cubic meter. That is cheaper than the tap water in Beijing. Researchers at the Laoshan laboratory in Qingdao built it, and they are calling it a world first. And Rizhao is not alone. Up the coast in Yantai, a much bigger plant, funded jointly by China and France, does the same thing with the warm cooling water power stations, flush out year-round. Its first phase alone makes 100,000 tons of fresh water a day, and it runs almost completely unmanned. The pattern is the same everywhere you look. Take the heat a factory is wasting and use it to turn seawater into fresh water. Now, pay attention to this next number, because it explains why China is chasing this so hard. On the North China Plain, where much of the country's wheat and people are packed together, each person has access to only about 250 cubic meters of water a year. The United Nations calls anything under 500 acute water scarcity. So the most crowded, most farmed part of China is living at roughly half the level the UN already calls a crisis. For years, they papered over the gap by pumping groundwater, and the water table under that plain has fallen by roughly 1.5 meters every year since the 1990s. You cannot run a country that size on an aquifer that is quietly collapsing. That is the real pressure behind all of this, and China has answered at a scale that is hard to picture. As of this year, it has 167 desalination plants running along its coast. together producing just over 3 million tons of fresh water a day. That is enough to cover the daily household water for around 15 million people, and the government already has another 600,000 tons a day under construction. Think about what cheap desalination actually does here. It takes the one thing the North China Plain does not have, fresh water, and pulls a nearly endless supply of it out of the one thing sitting right next door, the ocean. For the first time, the coast can leave its collapsing aquifers alone and pull its water straight from the sea, at a price that does not bankrupt a city. That is a country buying its way out of a water emergency. But here is the part that reframes the whole thing. At that plant in Rizhao, the fresh water is almost a side effect. Run the seawater through, and you do not just get clean water. You get three things at once: clean water, green hydrogen, and a stream of mineral-rich brine that keeps its value instead of being dumped back into the sea. They call it 1 in, 3 out. The same batch of seawater and the same free heat pay for themselves 3 different ways, so the water no longer has to carry the whole cost by itself. And once you see that, the real breakthrough gets obvious, and it is not a new membrane or a secret material. It is location. China did not make desalination cheap by inventing a magic filter. It made it cheap by parking the plant next door to factories that were already throwing energy away, and selling everything that came out. The West spent decades treating that price as a fixed fact of physics. China treated it as an arrangement problem and built the whole thing around free energy. Now, I want to be fair about the limits, because this is where the story has to stay honest. The Rizhao plant is small, and it is new. It has run continuously for a matter of weeks, not years, and that headline price leans hard on getting the heat for free, which only works if you happen to sit beside the right kind of factory. Not every coastline has a steel mill next door with heat to spare. There is a fair skeptic's point too. The oil-rich Gulf states have quietly pushed their own desalination costs below 50 cents per cubic meter for years, so cheap seawater is not something only China can do. What China has shown is how low the number can fall when the power is heat you were already wasting. If you are the kind of person who would rather understand how something actually got cheap than be told it could never happen, subscribe. That is the whole point of this channel. So think back to that 28 cents. 1,000 liters of drinking water, lifted out of the sea, running on heat a factory was about to waste anyway. The ocean was always right there. The hard part was making it cheap enough to drink. Here is the question I will leave you with. Should the rest of the world be copying China's waste heat playbook, or is that price simply too good to be true? Tell me below.